You are listening to the sounds of the Right On Network.
Hello, and welcome back. This is episode 13 of 30 Minutes to Get podcast, where we cover Peter Jackson's docuseries, Get Back, 30 minutes at a time. My name is Chris, and as always, I'm joined by AJ. AJ, how are you tonight?
Chris, I'm doing quite well. I'm happy to talk about 30 Minutes to Get Back. And like I told you before we started recording, I was eating dinner, and I couldn't help but overhear these three guys. They were like ranging in ages. And one of them was telling them about the Get Back documentary. And they're like, oh, what'd you watch it on? And he's like, oh, I don't know. And then I just piped up. I was like, oh, it's on Disney Plus. Now, I have this on DVD. I didn't have the wherewithal. I was out of it. So I didn't go like, hey, I do this podcast. But that just lets you know, this is out there in the ether. They're going to find us. Hey, it's magnetic. They're going to find us. I'm ready to talk some Beatles talk, some Get Back.
The Beatles are evergreen. They're evergreen.
Yes.
They're always going to be in conversation.
And even to mention that, and I at first I groaned, and then the next day I was like, no, I better click on this. So I was stuck in traffic. I clicked on it, and on YouTube, it was this thumbnail. It said, Gen Z's favorite Beatle is George Harrison. And I was like, no, that's mine, no. And I clicked on it, and they were saying all the things I knew that they would say, but like you mentioned, it's evergreen because we're far removed from when the Beatles first started. And like, there's a lot of things where you're like, oh, they're going to talk about this forever. This is never not going to be talked about. And then like, I'm not in a grocery store and someone's just bringing up Pride and Prejudice out of nowhere. But Pride and Prejudice is still mentioned. So the Beatles, we can't take for granted that it'll just always be talked about. So I'm glad we're doing this podcast, Chris.
So am I. And, where we left off, too, we finished off part 2 the last time we got together, right? And that was when we started to plan to do the live event on the roof. And they were still kind of working on Let It Be. And it sort of feels like the finish line is in sight for the Beatles right now, right? Like they're in the home stretch. And I don't know. Do you feel like you see a light at the end of the tunnel for this project that they're doing?
I was walking around at home and I was just wondering, Peter Jackson, they're doing this thing where they're showing us a calendar and they're Xing out days. And when I see that like dread. There's a countdown. The walls are closing in. I'm getting claustrophobic. But now I'm starting to think, is that what I'm putting on it? Because it feels like they still don't have their act together. But now, like, when I see your notes and stuff, it's like, oh, okay, they're getting it down. So it may be, I'm looking at it like, hey guys, there needs to be a sense of urgency. You're just hanging around. And now when I read your notes, I'm thinking, no, maybe it's like, no, we got it. That's why we're not, hey, you see the duck and it looks calm, but below the water it's freaking out. So I'm thinking, am I projecting on this, or what is Peter Jackson trying to convey with that calendar cut down thing? Is he saying, dude, it's about to hit the fan because they're not ready? Or no, dude, we're ready. We're just, we're ready for this, get this done.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the rest of this of part 3 goes beyond the first 30 minutes we just watched for this episode. Because right now, in the last episode as well, they just seem like they're in a groove. They're, they're playing songs, they're putting things down on tape. They're in the booth listening. They're we're finding out that certain versions that we're hearing are the ones that end up on the album Let It Be. So it just feels like it's starting to coalesce into the finished product, or at least as close to the finished product as we get for, they, I guess, abandon this and move on to Abbey Road, and then Phil Spector comes in and puts it together. So, but it sounds like a lot of stuff that they're working on is sort of getting all the rough edges sanded off. I mean, there's still a little bit of frustration, and we'll get to that, but for the most part, it feels like they're in a groove.
And I reminded myself that, okay, if it's an 8-hour workday, they're really only showing us maybe 20 minutes out of that workday. So I'm keeping that in mind as well.
Now, it was funny that you mentioned George Harrison, because something I'm noticing as we watch this is that Peter Jackson, in a lot of transition scenes, is playing George Harrison songs. And I'm wondering if he's, a George guy as well. But it almost feels like it's turning George into maybe the emotional center of the documentary. And I don't know, do you feel any of that? Because we did, he was the one who left the band. He's the one who came back. He's the one who kind of feels like in the beginning he wasn't really a part of the songwriting process. And I feel like last episode or the episode before last, when they were talking about India, one of his songs was playing. I feel like we heard one of his songs at the end of part 1, possibly. So even his solo songs that end up being released after the Beatles break up are finding their way into this documentary. And I'm just curious if you've noticed that as a George fan.
I saw that with your notes, and I was like, yeah, that's very interesting. I think when I looked at that thumbnail and they were talking about George Harrison being a champion for Gen Z, they mentioned how, like, he was one of the integral parts about, hey, we should stop touring. Because I could see how that would take a toll on him. And, they put in there that whole thing where George was like, hey, when we went on that trip to India, it wasn't about being yourself. That wasn't the point. The point was you need to find yourself. If you were being yourself, you totally missed the mark. And like just the whole thing with, we made it to the top. Here we are now, entertain us. And this isn't it. I don't know what it is, so I'm going to go on a search for it. But like the fame and fortune, that's not what it's about. And you got to think, for back then in the 60s, to kind of express that on a mainstream level, that had to be like a first on like pop culture. I am not a Shakespeare person, but I think Shakespeare, he's like one of those first people in the English language to go like, okay, this is a king, and the king is lamenting about like, heavy is the head that wears a crown. So now the audience is like, whoa, wait a minute. A king can have issues and problems and like self-doubt? Wait a minute, huh? So yeah, I think George Harrison is the heart and spirit of the Beatles, and especially this recording process. So if Peter Jackson isn't doing this purposely, then it's just happening just organically, inherently. But yeah, there is something about that where, like you're saying, even his post-Beatles work is making this way into the documentary. So what is up with that?
Right. And like you were saying, George seems to be the one who's having the most existential crisis about being a Beatle at this moment in time. Paul seems frustrated, and he's just churning out music. And John seems a little aloof in a way. He's like, oh, I want to be a Beatle, and if we're going to be here, I'll be here, and if we're not, I'll be home. But George's journey in this documentary so far seems to be mirroring the band itself. Like it's orbiting around his decisions. I mean, not that he is making all the music, but it just seems to be that he's the center of this in some way.
And Paul is doing it in his own ways too, with Long and Winding Road and Let It Be. He's doing that. George Harrison, he's definitely commenting on what's happening, because we're going to get Here Comes the Sun. We're getting All Things Must Pass. He's already said that. And on the album All Things Must Pass, he's still commenting on things that were going on during these recording sessions. So with You're Giving Me the Wah-Wahs and all this stuff, it's happening. So yeah, you're right about that. George Harrison, his existential crisis is the metaphor or manifestation of these recording sessions.
And this kind of leads into a great moment because we do get a little bit of George and Ringo by themselves, working in the studio before John and Paul show up, and they're doing Puss's Garden. And they're kind of working on it together. And I had a lot of fun with this moment where I had to watch it like twice because John and Paul take up so much oxygen when we talk about the Beatles, when anybody does. And to see George and Ringo having a creative moment together and kind of being the focus of what was happening just felt rare for us as fans to get to see. And seeing how they kind of had a rapport and were able to work together and they looked like they were having a good time. It just it was just one of those things where I'm like, sometimes I forget that these two guys are giants as well. It's not just John and Paul.
Yes, guys, I'm sorry. Next time I'm going to have it down. There's a writer in Rolling Stone magazine. He's been there for decades. And when George Harrison passed away, he wrote this great write-up to really encapsulate George Harrison and the band. But, he even talked about in the movie Help, there's a part where they're performing You Gotta Hide Your Love Away. And the actress is like transfixed on John. And George is doing all these things to kind of get attention. Like, hey, I'm here too. So it's kind of interesting where it's like, okay, I'm in the biggest band of all time. And even I'm like an outsider within this band. And George Harrison, in those early days, he joked and said that he and Ringo, they were the economy Beatles. So it's like, hey, if you can't afford a premium, hey, you can get us. Now, this is my favorite episode that we've done because I love this thing where Ringo, he's always getting there first. And he's on the piano and he's like working out Octopus's Garden. And George walks up like, hey, what's this? And he's telling him like, okay, maybe you should get from this chord to that chord. And he's kind of telling him, when you do this, then it'll be recursive and then it'll kind of fold in back on itself and then it's completed. Like he's like this is how you should do songwriting. He says this, this, and this, and then it'll resolve itself. Like he's kind of telling him like, you're getting there and then this is how you can end it. And I'm just like, again, the fact that we even witnessed that, because I don't even know, like, was I aware that this was a Ringo number? Because, usually like Yellow Submarine, this is something like Paul wrote it and he gave it to Ringo, or right. Ringo's doing covers. So I don't know. Did I know that Ringo wrote this himself before watching this documentary? But I just love what this was about. Just like, because I even told this to those three gentlemen that I saw when I was eating dinner, where I was like, do you know how many floods and fires there have been where we've lost material? So the fact that we just still have this, I'm in awe. I'm still like in awe. I'm still not numb to this whole project we're doing.
Yeah, and I feel the same way as you did too with Octopus's Garden. I feel like I just assumed it was something that, Paul and John tossed off. Probably mostly Paul because it sounds like a Paul tune. And yeah, it's amazing that we get to see this, that we get to watch this moment with these two guys. And, and then when John shows up and he goes on drums and Billy Preston comes back, and it just seems like everybody's having a really good time. And they're moving effortlessly, right, between songs. And I almost feel like that Genesis starts with Ringo and George doing this Octopus's Garden song. Just put a smile on everybody's face as they're walking in the door.
I remember the first time I ever heard Octopus's Garden, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Look at all this whimsy. But now, knowing the context of when this was written and some of the things that we see in this particular 30-minute segment, it's like, again, it's another one of those, I'm kind of longing on something that's not this. Like, I want to get out of here. I wish I was in another place. I wish I was in an Octopus's Garden, but not here. Mm-hmm. So now when you see that, like, he's given the whimsy to it, but when you know the context, oh, there's like melancholy just in the bedrock of this.
That's pretty good context to pick up. Yeah, that's an interesting twist on it that now I'm going to think about.
She's so heavy.
So yeah, they end up working on a bunch of 50s songs. They work on Let It Be. And I think the documentary said that the version of Long and Winding Road that they get down in this session is the one we hear on the album Let It Be. But, it made me wonder watching it, because that's about as finished as that product gets, even though it sounds like they want to tweak some stuff. They're talking about, something like the two pianos are on top of each other, so it was hard to know which was which. And I always wonder whenever I hear them talking about tweaking these tracks, but they never get there because those aren't the tracks that end up on the album that we're familiar with, how different some of these songs would be if the four of them kind of finish these off like they usually do, instead of sort of leaving them out, in a box, and then other people come in and try to engineer an album out of it, and they've already moved on to other songs. And I know, Paul comes back and they do Let It Be Naked, but even that, I don't think would represent how those songs would sound if the entire band finished it. And, I'm wondering if any of those thoughts of what could have been had entered your mind at all watching some of this happen.
Yeah, folks that's listening to this, okay, I think we need to keep in mind, if the band had it their way, one, we would have gotten these songs eventually. But if they had it their way, all the music that's on Let It Be, we were not supposed to have had that really throughout all the 70s. Maybe later where they're like releasing like an unreleased thing here, an unreleased there. But we weren't supposed to get the Let It Be album. Remember, they're like, okay, let's get our act together. They did Abbey Road. That was supposed to be the swan song. And we walk off into the sunset. And then, boom, they released the Let It Be stuff. But all these songs that we're hearing on Let It Be, and we're like, oh, wow, this is great. Or, oh, wow, I wish they could have got this together. Because so we were not supposed to get this Let It Be album.
Yeah, so that's something that I constantly have to think about. Like, oh, these songs, they never really finished these, even though we're hearing, what we're familiar with. So it's just an interesting note to keep remembering as you watch the documentary.
And they sound like that. Like, at the end of the day, as much as I love the Let It Be songs, as much as I love For Your Blue, I love I Me Mine. I love all the stuff. I love Two of Us. But really, like you're saying, if they knew at the time, like, okay, we're going to be a band all the way till 1993, they would have went back in the studio and worked more on those Let It Be records. It's just they came out after the fact. But then, having said that, Get Back, that came out as a single. They were like, no, we're good with this. And then Old Brown Shoe, which we'll talk about later, that ended up on a B-side. So I guess they, yeah. But
yeah, some of them they do finish. I feel like, if I'm being honest, and we'll get to that when we get to the second day where they do Let It Be, that one may not have been finished the way they wanted. There's a lot of stuff it seemed they were getting frustrated with. But one of the other things I noticed before we get to the next day is Linda brings her daughter to the studio. And I thought this was a really interesting thing because there was a lot of joy happening. They were playing with her. They were letting her do things. I remember there was a moment where she was like singing into the microphone, and John Lennon was trying to get Yoko Ono's attention because he was like, listen, she sounds like you. And it just felt kind of joyous. And I don't know if it was a reminder for them or just me watching it, but it just reminded me that music is supposed to be joyful. And there was a lot of joy happening in the studio in this segment. And that's all I kept thinking about, of all the stress that they had and fighting and the back and forth about who contributes and who doesn't. it was like a pressure valve was released because they had a little girl in the studio that they were entertaining. And it just, all I kept thinking of was this looks like a joyous day. And, that was just one of those things that I felt was a really good thing for Peter Jackson to include. And watching them jump around on the instruments and working in the studio together and just having a good time. It was just one of those things that I picked up on where, we always hear how contentious this recording session was. So it was nice to see. And I wasn't sure if there was anything from that you might have picked up before we move on to day 18, or if there was anything else from this first part of this episode.
I did see clips of this going around during Father's Day, and it was like, hey, look at the Beatles. They went straight in dad mode with this girl around. And I would say they were definitely in Unc mode. So Uncle mode, where right. Ringo's behind the drums and she's banging on the cymbals or whatever, and it's not phasing him. He's drumming along too. You could tell he even probably told her like, hey, go with this cadence, because they were kind of in sync. And then John sitting there telling her about like, oh yeah, you can eat cats. She's like, you can't eat cats. Well, not the spider ones. You don't want to eat those. And she's like, this one has stripes. Oh, you don't want to eat those either. Like, they were totally unfazed. Like, it wasn't like, whoa, this kid is in here. What's this? Like, man, when I was 20 years old, if you told me like there was a kid rolling around the studio in there, I wouldn't have believed it, because I would have just thought these dudes are so psychedelic out. There's no way that would have happened. Now, when I see this, I'm like, oh, well, of course. But in one of those situations, they say when they're doing Long and Winding Road, you see the words and it says, and this is the recording that's on the album. I'm like, what? It seemed very informal. It seemed very like, but no, with the daughter rolling around, having fun, all this stuff, one, it humanized them, and it's very endearing. So like at the end of the day, like, guys, look, when it comes to music and it comes to music in the 60s and 70s, there's so many heavyweights. And to see this footage of this kid just having fun in there and all this stuff, and like no one's looking like, what is she doing here? Like everyone's like, oh, okay, yeah, this kid in here. All right, yeah, interact with her and keep doing your job. Sure, why not? Linda Eastman. It's very endearing. It humanized them.
Yeah. Yeah, it really did that for everybody in there. I mean, even people who weren't in the band. It was a great, like, kind of human moment. And that's the end of the day. And then we get to day 18, which is January 27th, which means we're in Monday. And the show is, the concert's supposed to be Wednesday. So we've only got like 2 days now. And they're digging into some more songs. They do a couple more old rock and roll songs. They rehearse a few more things. But one of the big things they do, which you mentioned, is they start working on Old Brown Shoe again. And Billy Preston seems to be kind of active in helping George with some chord progression. And I know, you love this song. So, watching this part, how much did you get out of that for yourself, just as a fan?
So, okay. I didn't know they had already talked about this beforehand, because you said they were covering it again.
I believe unless I'm making a mistake, wasn't that the one where they were putting the newspaper in the piano?
Now, that was when they were doing For Your Blue.
Oh, thank you. For You Blue. So I confused the two.
But the same kind of vibe, though. And now I'm starting to put together, and you guys are going to have to write into us at 30getback@gmail.com. I think in England, this is how it started off. That's how they all started. But I think in England, too, around this point, there was like this blues reappreciation revival. Because, like, I always think, like, okay, like, Don't Let Me Down, all this stuff. Like, this is like some muddy, heavy stuff. Like, why were they doing this? And now it's not in a vacuum. This is going on because you're about to get Led Zeppelin. You're about to get the Rolling Stones bringing Muddy Waters out on tour with them in the 70s. So this isn't in a vacuum. This is like a vibe going on in that area. So like George Harrison bringing in Old Brown Shoe, because you got to remember, These dudes were doing like psychedelic, futuristic stuff with Magical Mystery Tour and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band, all this stuff. So for George to go like, hey, I got this thing. And like, if he said he listened to a 1930s record and inspired him, I would believe it. Because that's what Old Brown Shoe sounds like. I love Old Brown Shoes. I love I just love the mechanics of the song. But what I really love, because this is one of my favorite moments in the documentary, is Billy Preston there. And he's like, hey, Billy, what's this? And he's like playing these chords for him. He's like, what is this? And like Billy Preston showing him stuff. He's like, wait, how'd you do that? Wait a minute. Hey, again, I can't believe we're witnessing this. And this seems like one of the first times where Paul is like, yeah, what are you doing there? That seems interesting, cool. And like he's engaged and involved and like, oh yeah, let me do this over here. But yeah, Old Brown Shoe, I don't know where like George is getting like this soulfulness from. I love it. I just absolutely love it.
Yeah. And I was going to mention that too, that Paul looked like he was having a blast with this.
Yeah. You know what? And it's on the piano. And like George is like, yeah, the piano's hard because I know he did With You, Without You on the piano. So, but that's not really one of his first go-tos. So he was like, yeah, I wouldn't be able to, like some of the stuff I'm doing with the chord progression, I wouldn't be able to do this on the guitar. So I have to do this on the piano. And like Paul, he's a piano man. So he's like, oh yeah, this is great. This is a good groove.
And it's a great song. It's a great song.
It's a great song. It ends up being a B-side on the, they're going to crucify me. The Ballad of John and Yoko.
The Ballad of John and Yoko. Okay.
And they're like, and I remember John saying like, hey, it's a B-side because like, hey, I'm stepping out of this Old Brown Shoe. Baby, I'm in love with you. That's all I need to hear.
Yeah, it was great to see that come together. It was great to watch them all take part. It was great to see Billy really involved. You know, it showcases that he's more than just a guy who showed up to play the keyboards for a little while. He's, you know, I think we see him on bass at one point, or maybe even rhythm guitar, and he has an active role in kind of helping George shape this track, and that was a lot of fun. And then by the time we get to the end here, after they do a few more songs, it's almost like the conflict has changed for them, because right at the end, I'm watching that Paul is getting a little frustrated, I think, with Let It Be. He's having trouble figuring out how the ending is, I think, and nothing is really speaking to him. I think you can even see him kind of like give up at one point. And I feel like they focus some of their energy at setup of the studio, because they're like, we can't hear ourselves. We can't hear the guitar. I can't tell if I'm playing the right part. We need speakers. We need PAs. And it was just interesting to see the direction of their frustration being set to people outside of the band as opposed to sometimes at each other, we've seen in the past. And now they're like, we need better setup. We're going to play these songs the way we want to play them and not, you know, mess up and hear what we're doing and understand like, oh, this isn't working. Let's move to this. And it just seemed like there is still frustration. They are still trying to write these songs and they're having some trouble, but they also don't seem to be blaming each other for playing something that they don't want to hear. I mean, at least that's what I was getting out of it. I don't know if you had any feelings about that, or if you felt like, you know, they were maybe hiding their frustration because Ringo's not playing the drums the way Paul wants him to, but instead of starting a fight with Ringo, he's, you know, talking about the PA system.
The way it was coming off to me, it was as if they're like, okay, we've been doing this for a while, and we all split up and we were hanging out with other people, and we saw what they had in their studios. And when we came back, we're like, we don't have this. Why don't we have this? And they've been saying this for a long time. They're like, wait a minute, the Beach Boys have this. Why don't we have this? So that's what it felt like. That's how it came off to me. It came off to me like we were hanging out with the Rolling Stones and they had this kind of setup. We're the Beatles, darn it. Why don't we have this? It
Yeah.
seems very lo-fi. Like, to me, like when I was a kid listening to Magical Mystery Tour and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band, I thought like, oh, this is like some sophisticated setup stuff. But then again, they're not doing that with this. It's very lo-fi. So to me, like it seems like public access what they're doing in there.
Mm-hmm,
So I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess, yeah, all right, sure. But that's what they were going for too. Remember, they weren't going for studio wizardry.
Right. Yeah, and they wanted a more live sound, so they went to, and that's what they were going to Apple Studios for. And so with that though comes some limitations, because it looks like a small space. I mean, I know they have all the instruments in there, but it doesn't look like it's a big studio.
I'm almost thinking like, I mean, I know there's things like George Martin where he's there and he's giving advice and he's directing the engineers and all this, but I'm kind of thinking like, what did they need him in there for this? Because like they're moving mics, but hey, that's part of the point is you don't know I'm wearing makeup. That's the point. So yeah, George Martin doing his job. It's just it seems very lo-fi, but that's what they were going for.
And that's pretty much the end of this part of the documentary that we cover. These rehearsals that they had, where it does look like things are moving along, but it's not perfect yet. They're not, sold on every final version of what they've been working on, but they're being very productive. They're getting a lot of stuff down on tape, and like I said at the beginning of the episode, they just seem like they're kind of in the home stretch a little bit. And they've only got 2 days, so we're going to see how much pressure builds after this, where, they're starting to notice the equipment is not maybe up to the task, and see if that turns into something or if they're able to push past it.
We're going to go back to Kansas City. We're going to shake, rattle, and roll. We're going to make sure you don't step on our blue suede shoes. And please, guys, email us at 30getback@gmail.com. What were your favorite moments in here? Did you like when, I don't know, Ringo was bored with it all and he was just going to sleep? John saying like, hey, we should gospel up more of Let It Be. It's all good, Bring your kid to work day. Bring your daughter to work day. Bring your spouse to work day. That's what I love with this, what's going on here. We're seeing it's a family affair now. So
family affair. Make sure you don't eat any striped cats or spotted cats.
That's right. With Star Trek, the original series, it's just the workers on the ship. And then with Next Generation, hey, you bring your families with you. And that's what we're seeing with the Beatles in the later run. Bring your wife, bring your spouse. Let's celebrate the fact that Yoko Ono's paperwork went through. She's divorced now, so John and Yoko can have their ballad. And when they do that little rendition of Oh Darling, and he turns it into, we told the lawyer, Yoko got out of her paperwork. That is on that anthology. So I have been listening to them messing around singing that for like the past 20 years. But email us, and when you look at the show notes, we'll have the website on there and some other places where you can reach us. We truly appreciate it, guys. So until next time, I'm AJ.
And I'm Chris.
Let it be.